Till now we have seen the play of forces of S2 and S3, which are basically moving pressure. We have not come across S1 as yet. So let us see how S1 is able to help us explain some unexplained phenomena, and one of them is two-slit experiment. And as we had seen, it's all about light travel, and it behaves very crazily. When you flash a beam of light on single slit, you have a single band. When you make it flash through two slits, you get a interference pattern, suggesting that earlier it was moving as a line, now it is moving as a wave related to interference pattern. And that when they sent a photon by photon on these two slits, still it was seen that the interference pattern came up, and that when you try to put the detector on, what was least expected, which was light traveling like a line, was restored, and when you did switch off the detector, the wave pattern or the interference pattern came up. So the basic unexplained part of it is that it is sometimes light is traveling like a line or as a wave. How would light know whether there is one slit, two slits? It is unexplained. And then it is okay when you are saying that there are two photons which when they cross, they travel like wave, and hence there is an interference pattern. That means there should be two photons for an interference to happen. The fact that when you send one photon, even then the interference is happening, that means that the photons themselves are not traveling as a wave when it crosses the plane 1. And then the next question was, how does a photon on plane 1, it is just a point, how does it get to cover the length and breadth of plane 2? And then we have also seen that when this photon is made to pass through these two slits, sometimes it passes through the first slit, sometimes it is in the second slit. Why is this photon moving sideways? And then the issue with the detection, when you are detecting it, the line travels as though it is in a straight line when you don't detect the interference pattern. So let us try and see how Spacity is able to explain. So mandate of space is that space is acting on every mass, that is that S1, the holding pressure. We know that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Now when space is acting on mass, which is photon has to react. So the action is a compressive force on the entire surface. The reaction would be a radiating force, which is like an energy sphere. So every photon will have an energy sphere because of the action of S1, mass, so space acting on mass of photon. There would be an energy sphere which is continuous and outwardly radiating. It is energy spheres which are going continuously away because space is continuously acting on it and the mass is fighting back. Now how can we apply this concept? So now we have one photon. Let us only consider the case of one photon so that you can make it complex, two photons, multiple photons, and then it will be easier to understand. To begin with, a simpler case, one photon only. It has got an energy sphere which is ahead of it. So the energy sphere will reach plane 1 even before the photon reaches the plane 1. Now this energy sphere would, when it crosses these two slits, it is one sphere. When it is passing through the two slits, it creates two twin identical spheres, sphere 1a and sphere 1b, as is shown here. They are in different color only for the sake of clarity, otherwise they are exact replica. And these are the spheres which are interacting with each other and creating an interference, and that interference is a series of highs and lows, and this is on the surface of respective spheres. Now when that is set up, the photon, what does it have to do? When it crosses the slit, it has a choice of many such path that these two spheres have created. These two twin spheres have created for the parent photon to choose from, and then they follow the path of least resistance. It rides all the highs, and there are many highs and lows, and it is not necessary that it should go straight. Wherever the interference pattern takes it, it would go and fall on the plane 2, and this would happen. This is the reason why it is able to paint the whole surface. A single point photon will be able to reach the entire length and breadth of the plane 2. So the diameter of these spheres is represented here by the height of the interference pattern, and when you add these two diameters together, you will have the width of the interference pattern. So what we have seen here is that the photons do not travel as wave after the split, after the slit. It is just that the energy spheres prepare an interference pattern for the photon just to follow it, and that just one photon is sufficient to create these two interference patterns. If you remember, in the earlier case we had said that to create interference pattern you need two photons, then only they are traveling as wave, and then you can have an interference pattern. Here we can see that just one photon, thanks to the spacity and these energy spheres, one photon can create an interference pattern. Now what happens when you have another photon? Would these energies, each of them is being acted upon by space, each has its own energy sphere, would they create an interference with each other? They would not. If at all they would interfere with each other, forget the slits, forget the two slit experiment. Wherever we see in this room, you would see interference pattern everywhere. The fact that you do not see those interference pattern, which shows that if the energy spheres are because of two different parents, they do not interact with each other. But for these energy spheres to interact, the parent photon should be the same. So you send one, two, multiple photons. So the first photon crosses, it creates its own twins and it helps it fall on this plane. The second photon has its own independent twins, and that again is creating a path of least resistance for the second photon. So they do not interact with each other, and you have the complete interference pattern falling. So this is what we explained, that when you have one just photon, just one photon and one slit, no interference pattern, because when the sphere is crossing over the slit, it still remains a single sphere and the photon goes in straight line. So when you have photon after photon being sent, one photon, it splits into two twins and the photon just rides on the highs and lows created by the twin spheres. And when you have many photons, which is a flash of light beam, in the same way each are independent of other, so there would still be twins corresponding to each photon, and they would go ahead and make an interference pattern on plane 2. Now we should try and see how Spacity is able to explain, when the detector is switched on, why does interference pattern disappear. That is possibly because when you are putting a detector, obviously you are sending a series of waves and you need to receive these waves back, so that when the photon crosses it, you know what is happening to that photon. So these waves which are going this way and coming back, they themselves are creating a boxing effect, in the sense these two spheres are there, when the photon crosses these twins are there, but they are boxed in either side by these two wave interference, and hence the photon, though it wants to go this way, that would not be the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance would be limited to the straight lines, and hence though exactly the same situation is happening, What we get to see is that it is traveling like a straight line. And obviously when you remove the detector off, we have the normal situation wherein you have the interference pattern coming up. But what is still not explained is why does photon switch between two slits? It is as though, and even if you let us say the flash beam is here and the plane 1 is here, you move it a bit, still the photon is switching between these two slits. That means there is a lateral movement happening between photon. It's as though photon is not going in straight line, but it is going like a zigzag. And of course, it is a limited movement, because if you increase the slit, the space between the slits, obviously these photons would not be able to enter that slit.